Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Denis Simon, and I'm going to be the moderator for this second day of our conference on the evolving role of universities in the U.S. Innovation ecosystem. We had a very productive day yesterday with our president's panel and a very lively discussion on our panel on immigration and universities. And today we will have two panels, one on national security and universities, and the second panel on university industry relations. So we look forward to also having another productive day. I want to welcome everyone. Those of you who were with us yesterday, thank you again for coming back. I guess that shows we did something right. And those who are new, I think you're in for a real treat, particularly given the experts that we've been able to marshal together to come to this program. This morning, we have four very knowledgeable experts who can discuss with us the questions about national security and the integrity of the research enterprise in U.S. universities. And the four panelists are first, David Fleshler, who is the immediate past president of AIEA, and he currently serves as the vice provost for international affairs at Case Western University. Our second panelist is David Hoffman. David is the Steed Family Professor of the Practice in Cybersecurity Policy at the Sanford School of Public Policy here at Duke University. Our third presenter will be Rebecca Keiser. Rebecca is the Chief of Research Security Strategy and Policy and Head of the Office of International Science and Engineering at the National Science Foundation. And finally, but last but not least, David Kris. David is the founder of Culpers Partners in the West Coast, and he's also an expert in intelligence, law enforcement, and security issues. Their full bios can be found on our website, and you can find out detailed information about each of them from that website. Each of our speakers this morning will spend about 10 minutes providing some sort of opening remarks, and then we will open the floor for questions and comments from our audience. Please use the Q&A function for your questions. And we will try to take as many questions as possible, given our time limit. We're due to run till about 11 o'clock this morning. That should give us ample time to take enough audience questions. So the order of the speakers will be David Fleshler first, then followed by David Kris, Rebecca Keiser, and then David Hoffman. So without further ado, let me pass on the floor to David Fleshler.
Thank you, Denis. It's always difficult to be called an expert because you never know how people view you, but I appreciate the thought. I want to start this morning by acknowledging what's going on in Ukraine. Obviously, when our panel was created, it was long before, several weeks before, long now, we knew that Russia would attack Ukraine. When we sat down, Denis and the other panelists, to talk about this session, the word Ukraine never came up. In fact, the center of our thinking was around China. But now I'd submit that the broad implications of what's going on in Ukraine are profound for this topic, national security and the integrity of the research enterprise in US universities. As we sit here today, we can't know where the war will end, whether it's going to spill over to other countries, and the effect of possible new boundaries between authoritarian regimes and democratic regimes. But I would submit that it's likely to have quite a profound effect. And Denis, I would look to you to possibly create another session to think about what that effect might have on the research enterprise. So as I began to think about our topic in relation to Ukraine, I thought there were several universal themes that we might want to talk about in general with the Ukrainian situation, but what we're going through with regard to China and other countries as well. So the first is our responsibility as universities and as researchers to create new knowledge and to solve the grand challenges. Climate change, disease across borders, COVID-19 obviously being the latest example, migration, and many other issues. I think we all understand that we can only meet these challenges by working together across boundaries. The most recent example that I can think of is the James Webb Telescope, which really only came into being because of the collaboration involving scientists literally from hundreds of universities around the world. And we start severing those connections, and we're not able to do the kinds of things that we all know we need to do as researchers and as societies. The second sort of broad idea or theme is that we need to protect our scientists at universities from discrimination due to race or national origin. I'll get into that a little bit, but we've seen much of this over the course of the last 3 or 4 years. Now, as Denis described, I'm the Senior International Officer at Case Western Reserve University. Unlike many of those who were part of the sessions in these 2 days, my view is an on-the-ground, campus-focused perspective. I'm both a strategist on campus and implementer of programs. So in addition to overseeing study abroad and services for international students who come to campus, I help coordinate the university's international strategy, which involves everything from engaging with the Cleveland and national communities on international issues to determining where to target university resources for international growth. So I'd like to describe a little of my work with the Cleveland community, because I think it relates to what we're seeing with regard to national security and the research enterprise. I'm the board chair of something called Global Cleveland, which works with immigrants and refugees to Cleveland. This is obviously good for humanity, but it's also good for the economy of our region, for all the reasons that most of you will relate to. Yesterday, I talked with the president of Global Cleveland, and we're dealing with an issue that I think all of our campuses are now going to start facing in light of what's going on in this last week. Global Cleveland essentially runs the sister city program in Cleveland, and we're getting major pressure to cut our relationship with our Russian sister city. Other cities have cut their relationships with Russian sister cities, citing the war in Ukraine. Global Cleveland is arguing that the sister city program is set up precisely to deal with issues like we see in Ukraine. The sister city program was started under President Dwight Eisenhower in 1956, in the height of the Cold War. I'm going to quote from the Sister City homepage. President Eisenhower envisioned a network that would be a champion for peace and prosperity by fostering bonds between people from different communities around the world. President Eisenhower reasoned that people from different cultures could understand, appreciate, and celebrate their differences while building partnerships that would lessen the chance of new conflicts. Isn't that precisely what we're doing in the research sphere? Isn't our responsibility as university officials to do what we can to assure that our researchers can work in a people-to-people way across borders to solve the big issues of science and technology? So this leads to the second broad theme that I want to talk about, which is we need to protect scientists at our universities from discrimination. As part of my role, I work with the leadership and researchers and others, including the Office of General Counsel, to determine how to comply with US law while doing our best to assure that researchers can maintain their freedom on problems important to their disciplines with colleagues from around the world. So as you can imagine, this last set of issues is taking up a greater and greater part of our time at Case Western Reserve. Let me quote from a letter that Case Western Reserve received from the Department of Education that notified us about a Section 117 investigation. The letter basically accuses us of failure, and I quote, to report all gifts, contracts, and/or restricted and conditional gifts or contracts from or with a foreign source. The DOE, now this, to be fair, this was in the last administration, but the letter has not been withdrawn. The DoD further takes what had been a policy of creating international educational and research relationships, which really is the foundation of our work, and turns it on its head. It characterizes, at least by implication, that our international activity is subversive. I quote from the letter, CWRU has an Office of Global Strategy, which has published a plan for internationalization, which includes 2 phases for transitioning CWRU to a massive international presence and creating major international partnerships. It adds some of CWRU's international efforts include recruiting students from the PRC and setting up partnerships in the PRC. This is precisely what we've been trying to do as a Center for International Affairs and as a university, and yet the idea of it is being turned, as I said, on its head. So three thoughts about this. First, this letter had a huge chilling effect on campus. We needed to respond. We brought in outside counsel for help, but more than ever, we are now cognizant of the research being conducted by individual faculty members. So they believe that there's sort of Big Brother, in some senses, watching them. Second, based on that letter and the general climate regarding university research, we were, in a sense, forced to create an undue foreign government influence task force. This Orwellian-sounding task force is charged with creating policies and procedures that adhere to the law and to government regulations, and as a sort of second, protecting our researchers, especially international researchers, in order to allow them to do their work. Third, and in a sort of counterintuitive way, the DOE letter is really a vindication that we're doing some important international work. So I'll tell you some of the others who have received just such a Section 117 letter: Stanford, Cornell, Harvard, MIT, and Yale. I've said around campus that we're in pretty good company. So several last thoughts before I wrap up. First, I've always thought that the secret sauce to the US, not only to our economy, but to our political and civic leadership, is our ability to invite and integrate people to our country from all over the world. With all of our problems, with all of the nativist language we now see, the US is, I believe, the only country in the world that can welcome and integrate people from countries all around the world, and in this case, researchers. So in order to continue our role as leaders in international research, we at US universities must continue to incorporate students and faculty from all over the world. Second, I'm a lawyer by training, so I understand that it's important that we protect our intellectual property and our national security, but we must do it in a way that does not threaten the research enterprise. Last week's announcement that the Justice Department is ending the China initiative is certainly welcome, but as a university community, we must recognize the fears of international researchers, especially those from China, other countries in Asia, and Asian Americans, are real and won't go away. We must continue to press both ourselves and the government to change the narrative and welcome researchers from all over the world. So one way that we can do that is to acknowledge that Asian and Asian Americans are dealing with bias and have done so for over 100 years in this country. So we at Case Western Reserve have created a quality initiative through and with the Higher Learning Commission that includes internationalization. That's part of our DEI work. which I think is going to become more and more important for our researchers to be able to say that we're doing work for them, and then they will continue to work on campus. Finally, one last observation with regard to China, but in light of the war with Ukraine, I think it can be thought of somewhat universally. China is a target of many people on both sides of the political and governmental spectrum. Let's find a way, and let's find people of goodwill on both sides to have a conversation with university leaders in the US and in China to work out what and actually I'm quoting Denis here, would call the rules of the road. This is something that Denis has talked about and championed over the course of the last several years. Let's come up with an agreed set of rules to protect the national security research and IP that comes out of our research labs, while at the same time assuring that our Chinese and Chinese American colleagues are able to fully participate in research without fear of a knock at the door from the FBI. If there is one concrete idea that emerges from our time today, I hope it is a way for us to engage in frank conversation with our international partners universities in order to allow international research to continue to flourish on our campuses. Denis, I think I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks very much. Let's move on to David Kris.
Okay, well, I'll begin also by thanking the hosts for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and by acknowledging David's sentiments on Ukraine and the larger challenges and larger context in which this conversation is now taking place. It was not planned for this. And more broadly, I think the pros and cons and the challenges of establishing rules of the road for engagement as opposed to disengagement with authoritarian regimes, for businesses, for academic institutions, and for governments. I think that I will, in keeping with what I think my role is on this panel as a DOJ alumni, sort of come at the issue from a slightly different direction, frame it a little differently, but I'm not sure I end up in any different place than David ended his remarks. So in terms of trying to frame the issue, I mean, I do think the threat from China is real and significant. And at the same time, I think the DOJ China initiative that David mentioned, that we all have awareness of and that has recently ended, was probably well-intended. And I think it may have helped raise awareness and cause adjustments in these rules of the road. I don't think it was at all well conceived or executed. And it's clear to me that it caused a lot of collateral damage. I think there was a much better way for DOJ to have done what it was trying to do. And I'll try to talk about that a little bit over the next 7 or 8 minutes. To begin with the threat, and this may be common ground, I don't know, but China has a plan, a series of plans, you might say, including its 1,000 Talents program, to use money to gain information and access. And it's part of a larger effort to steal technology and compete with the United States. It's not all in the form of classic espionage of the sort you see in the movies. There certainly is some of that. Chinese will try to recruit or target people with ties to the intelligence community, with access to classified information, so they can steal that information, spy versus spy stuff. But they also go after workers and companies that have high-tech data, whether classified or not, and they engage in a whole range of cyber theft of information and hacking techniques as well, beyond their human efforts. And all of this is going on at government agencies, or directed at government agencies, at businesses, including the defense industrial base, and at research institutions like universities. Their tactics are both short-term and long-term, and involve both carrot and stick. That is, they will entice people to cooperate. They will coerce people to cooperate. They will build relationships over time. They will not just immediately hack on the cyber front, but implant malware and exploit it and exfiltrate data later. So their efforts are wide and deep and enduring. And it's just by way of trying to understand what I think is going on from China, and not limited just to China, of course. Academic institutions are part of this. They do some very important research. Some of it's classified, some of it's not, but a lot of it is of interest to foreign adversaries and competitors. One of the questions that was circulated in advance of this panel discussion, I think in an effort to be a little provocative, was, are academics naive? And only a truly foolish person would take the bait of responding to that question in this setting. And so, of course, I would say, with no offense intended, to some degree, yes. That is, academics and universities do, I think, today care more about intellectual property and information security than they used to, but they're not as focused on it as, say, businesses, especially the DIB, the defense industrial base businesses, who aren't always so great either, or government agencies, who obviously aren't so great either. And they are very rightly, I want to say rightly, committed to transparency and the free flow of information, and they're not as profit focused. And that's a good thing. Society wants that. And I think we all want that, as David was saying. I think you have to look at the DOJ China initiative in this context and in the overall context of the government's China efforts. But I do think that it, as I said, had some very, very real errors in the way it was conceived and executed, including overreach. This MIT case, for example, although I haven't studied it in detail, so I wouldn't want to make an absolute statement on it, but just from the dismissal of everything and the way it blew up, it seems to be very, very bad, and produced a lot of harm to people. These programs, when DOJ launches them, they can be blunt instruments if they're not calibrated correctly against overreach. There's an old saying that every United States attorney is running for governor and looking for opportunities to gain publicity, and that every assistant US attorney is ambitious and wants to be a US attorney. That's not quite true, but you do need to consider carefully and build guardrails in if you do launch an initiative of the sort that DOJ launched. And it's hard to do that because DOJ is, in a way, a very sort of 19th century organization in its decentralized structure in an era in which threats and concerns are increasingly centralized. The goal of the DOJ initiative, I think, was important to raise awareness. But to put my cards on the table, I think what DOJ should have done here, and it would have been much better to have done, would have been to create some kind of amnesty program for universities or individual professors who had not properly documented or reported the money that they were getting from Chinese or Chinese government sources, to sort of encourage self-reporting and cleanup and improved compliance efforts. And that wasn't done. DOJ typically does not like to do that sort of program, but they do it from time to time. I think the inspectors general at the various agencies, including Department of Education or other grant-making agencies, may not want that kind of a program to be implemented, but I think that would have been a much better way to go, a much more precise way to come at this problem, to raise awareness, to encourage compliance and tighter and more accurate record keeping. And I understand why DOJ didn't do it, but I think they made a mistake. I think it would have been much, much better. What you're seeing now with the termination of the China initiative, as announced by Matt Olson, the current head of the office I used to head at the National Security Division, is that the ambitious US attorneys and AUSAs will probably shift their emphasis towards the more exciting, urgent matters of the moment, chasing Russian oligarchs and their yachts and airplanes. And so I suspect a lot of these Chinese cases will wither on the vine. I don't think they're going to find, frankly, that professors at universities are engaged in classic espionage. At the same time, I think the universities have, it's my sense, upped their game in terms of compliance and reporting of funding sources. And so maybe we will, sort of through an awkward, stumbling, inelegant, and frankly, as I said, an effort with a lot of collateral damage, lurch towards something that is a little more calibrated, a little more balanced. But I definitely think that DOJ did not do this well. And as I say, a better approach would have been an amnesty and self-reporting program. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm glad we've had some alternative perspectives broaden our discussion. So let me turn the floor over to Rebecca Keiser.
Thank you. I'm the Chief of Research Security, Strategy and Policy at NSF, which speaks for itself. And I am no longer the head of the Office of International Science and Engineering because we felt very strongly that it was important to separate research security issues from collaboration and be very distinct about what international collaboration is and make sure that we continue to promote the benefits of such collaboration. That being said, I argue that science and science collaboration has always had a geopolitical context. And in fact, the National Science Foundation was created right after World War II in direct response to the war. And it's in NSF's mission to promote the national defense. So we do need to take this into consideration even in fundamental research. As an example today, given Ukraine, the head of the Russian space agency Roscosmos, Dmitry Rogozin, has ordered that the Russian rockets be repainted to celebrate the invasion of Ukraine. And as a reminder, these rockets are the only route for US astronauts right now to go to the International Space Station. So this is certainly a concerning issue overall, and it is unclear right now, of course, what NASA is going to be doing. But we do need to think about these issues and think about national security issues, even in fundamental research. We often point to the National Security Decision Directive 189, NSDD 189, which was created in 1985. And it was in direct response to a study that was done, an academy study, that was trying to distinguish how we should collaborate, particularly with the Soviet Union at that time, given dual use concerns. And this policy that was created said that if research is considered fundamental research, it should be open and it should be widely available, and it should not be subject to classification. This was later expanded to not being subject to export control. I think we are honestly in a new geopolitical context today. David Kris talked about these concerning talent plans, talked about a different type of foreign influence that is understandably and unfortunately also impacting fundamental research. That's not to say that we should close off research in any way. I don't believe in that. I believe that research should be open, and we, the United States, have found that that's been successful. It has caused us to be an innovation leader. But we do have to think about what additional risk mitigation measures we should put upon our even fundamental research. For instance, there was recently a Hoover Institution report that discussed a Chinese Academy of Sciences institute, the Institute for Automation. And many US researchers collaborate with researchers that are part of this institute in fundamental research, and it truly is fundamental. The problem is that that same lab in that institute is also using that research for concerning and unethical purposes, according to the report. For instance, using it to further develop facial recognition technologies to be used to identify minorities in China. And certainly if US researchers were more aware of how their research was being used, I'm sure that there would be increased concern. We can't restrict mobility, however, international mobility, and international collaboration continues to be important. So I do agree with setting up some rules of the road. One example of something that we can think about is the JASON, who are a group of US scientists who also do research security and national security studies for the US government. They did a report for NSF in 2019 on fundamental research and research security. And they suggested putting into place an international collaboration catechism. These are questions we can ask and things we could consider before entering into a collaboration. And these are things like making sure that we can describe an engagement succinctly and without jargon. Is it fundamental research? And what are the institution's policies around creating the engagement? Are the terms of the engagement made clear in writing? Have all the participants been identified? And are all the participants known to the researcher, the principal investigator, and his or her institution? Are all the participants' conflicts of interest and commitment documented? And are there any aspects of the engagement that are not to be disclosed to any of the participants? And if so, what's the reason? Is there any aspect of the engagement that seems unusual, unnecessary, or poorly specified? Where do the funding and the other resources needed for the activity come from? And is it clear what each party is providing? And then how are the products from the research going to be distributed? And is that understood well in advance? And who is going to be given credit for developing those products? These are the types of things that if we ask and understand prior to entering into a collaboration, I think we could avoid many of these concerns. We do also have to differentiate these collaborations from what I call malign talent recruitment programs. And there's currently a working definition of malign programs that's in the Competes Act. We'll see if that comes through. I do believe it's important to distinguish those from other talent plans that are beneficial. I was part of a talent plan for the US government. It funded my dissertation research in Japan. I then owed the US government a year of service, which turned into 23 years of service. All the terms were open and transparent. Everyone knew, and it benefited me, and I hope it benefited the US government by my service, I hope. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think we just need to differentiate those from some of these more concerning ones with very concerning contracts. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Rebecca. And our last speaker will be David Hoffman. David?
Thanks, Dennis, and thank you for inviting me to participate. I teach at the Stanford School of Public Policy. I teach a variety of technology policy topics, but with a focus on cybersecurity and privacy. Prior to coming to Duke full-time, I was an employee at the Intel Corporation, where I focused on privacy and cybersecurity, among a variety of other legal roles. And I also chair an organization called the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law. In all of those contexts, I want to talk a little bit about what I feel are other impacts on research within the university that have happened because of the relationship between the US and China. So it's a bit of a different take than the other panelists have taken, and particularly with a focus on social science research and the broader context of research as the exchange of ideas between students and the impact that can come to for the world from those ideas, particularly for addressing the grand challenges that David talked about in his opening remarks. I think what we see, particularly in social science research, is that this is a combination of exchanges of ideas that happen inside the classroom and outside of the classroom. And there are different concerns and different risks depending upon which environment we're talking about, and that those have become more challenging over the last couple of years because of the pandemic, for reasons that I'll describe in a minute. I like to categorize the risks into different areas. I think we've primarily been talking about theft of intellectual property. I also do worry about lack of inclusion, particularly in the classroom, and for students who don't feel that they are being valued as active participants both in the classroom discussion and in the research that is done. I also am concerned about, though, equally the chilling effect on dialogue and participation in the research. And I'll give an example later of where that happens. And where it does not have a chilling effect, I worry about the long-term impact on students who might be connected and attributed to working on certain social science research that certain countries may find to be unacceptable to them, and what the impact of that is on the overall research enterprise. I think this became much more difficult from a social science perspective after the situation with Daryl Morey, the general manager of the Houston Rockets, when he tweeted out support for the protests in Hong Kong and was greeted with a response that had substantial impacts for him and for his employer because of the actions that were taken by Chinese companies to, in effect, be not only have punitive measures for him having taken that position, but in effect to chill that type of speech in the future. There's anecdotal reports from several colleagues of mine that in many companies shortly after that, explicit processes were put in place to tell employees that they were not to be tweeting out any messages similar in support. And that has filtered down into the classroom and the way that students engage in the classroom and engage in research. And so what I see inside the classroom is increased concern by students about what, particularly when we are talking about cybersecurity, when we're talking about government controls around privacy and cybersecurity, and we're talking about threats, particularly threats coming from China. Great concern from a number of students about whether they're going to be quoted on what they say inside the classroom. This has become worse during the pandemic, particularly because many of our classroom sessions are recorded. And even if our IT group has done an effective job making sure that those recordings are not going to be seen from by anybody outside of the university, that system is obviously not perfect. Anyone could do a screen capture of a recording. They could record that with a phone. They could transmit that to someone else. So we've made it so that it's possible, much more possible, than just somebody reporting that somebody said something in a classroom, that actually we can pass along the actual recording of people saying that. I see concerns among my Chinese students and my non-Chinese students about how to engage in that type of an environment. And then I see similar concerns outside the classroom. The proliferation, particularly in the more virtual environment that we've been in the pandemic, for how to do social science research on issues that affect China, that might include making public policy recommendations, that might include interviews with government policy stakeholders that involve China, and how to record that research as it's being done, what types of collaborative tools to be able to use for that, how secure those potentially are going to be, has actually been something that several of my students have raised considerable concerns about. Students that are concerned just for how they are going to be perceived potentially and what the impact will be if they are traveling to Hong Kong and to China, but then also the additional concern around employment afterwards, and whether there are companies, particularly in the financial sector, who might face pressure if all of a sudden a certain individual 5 years later, while they are in their career, it becomes public that they worked on things that might be perceived as critical of China. All of this I find to have a tremendous chilling effect on many students being able to not only do their best work, but also to get the most value out of that work. I have had several students actually requested certain work not be published because of this concern. So the one example I previewed earlier, and I'll just close with, is to say that I had a student who did some fascinating research. Actually, it was qualitative and quantitative research looking at social media posts by US corporate executives about the Hong Kong protests and about the social justice protests here in the United States, and then comparing which companies were actively posting about which issues, and then categorizing both quantity and evaluating those based on the amount of revenue from those companies that they were making in China. The student wrote an excellent paper that was well worthy of being published, and then actually developed a mini documentary on the particular topic after discussion with several peers and several experts in this area. We all collectively decided that that student should not publish any of that work for the potential concerns that it would have for that student's career in the future. We also took substantial efforts with that work on where we were going to store it, that it never got stored in virtualized tools outside of my laptop and the student's laptop. And I would generally describe this research as generally not all that controversial or sensitive compared to other research that we might potentially do, even social science research. So for this to be the case, even with this particular research project, I think it points out that we have a problem larger than just the stealing of intellectual property, but we have a problem with encouraging the level of dialogue and engagement that we want to have on these issues. And I think this is something that we need to address. So Denis, thank you very much for allowing me to participate.
Super, thank you very much. I think that we've now got a very broad array of issues that we can discuss. And let me start off by just posing a question, and that has to do with national competitiveness. What is the obligation and responsibility of American universities to help support this idea of promoting U.S. competitiveness? After all, we heard from Denis Fleshler, and they got criticized for it. Universities are, at least for the last 10 years, have been on a march towards globalization, trying to become more global, more internationally engaged. There's been an accepted norm that the universities should become even instruments of science diplomacy and diplomacy for science. They should be part of that world, if not the agents of the State Department or whatever. It's good for the United States to be part of this global effort. And now we're talking about national competitiveness in the midst of threats from China, et cetera, et cetera. Where do universities land in this kind of the tension that's building now between, we've heard words like obligation, responsibility, etc. And anyone who wants to answer this, raise your hand. How about David Fleshler? I'll start.
Oh, I see that Rebecca actually has her hand raised.
Either way, David, do you want to start and then I'll go?
No, go ahead. Go ahead. And then
Okay.
I'll go.
So I think the idea of national competitiveness and the idea of collaboration are actually not mutually exclusive. They actually are complementary. And international collaboration helps us be more competitive. I think having international students and researchers come to this country actually is one of our greatest exports. And that's something that should continue and has been incredibly beneficial. That being said, as I talked about, the line between fundamental and more applied research is increasingly becoming blurred. And we're thinking about this in the context of a new directorate that we're creating, which is technology, innovation, and partnerships. So it's still foundational research, but it's more use-inspired research. It's closer to issues of national and economic security. And because of that, we are certainly encouraging international collaboration there, but we are establishing a review process to ensure that those collaborations are mutually beneficial and don't cross this line of risk. Now, what that's all going to mean is going to be the devil's in the details. We're not quite sure yet. We do think we're going to be asking similar questions to what I specified in the catechism, just to make sure that it truly is mutually beneficial. I'll stop there. Thanks.
David?
So I'll add just a little bit. When you talk about national competitiveness, Denis, I think we need to distinguish between what is a governmental and perhaps an overall societal issue or responsibility, and what is a university responsibility. We've talked a little bit about science diplomacy. I think that universities, while I agree with Rebecca, while we will engage in international activities, and that will help the competitiveness of the U.S., I don't believe that universities have a direct responsibility for that. The sub-state or sub-government diplomacy that goes on between researchers at universities in the US and internationally both strengthens the relationships between the US and other countries and provides knowledge, information that ultimately results in heightened competitiveness. Now, I'll switch gears for 1 second and say that public universities in particular, but even private universities like Case Western Reserve or Duke, I believe have a sense of mission in their communities. Public universities in their mission statements and in their relationships with their state legislatures are specific in how they will help move their economies, regional economies, maybe state economies forward. And that's part of the reason that the state legislature puts money into the public universities. So in terms of sort of competitiveness, I think there's a direct relationship in specific states and in regions, less so with the national government.
Anyone else comment? Okay, let's go on. We have a question about are we conflating too many issues together? For example, programs like the 1,000 Talent Program in China, and we just saw putting that in the same category as IP theft. And why are we doing that? Don't countries have a right to seek out the best talent that they can get? Obviously, the United States does that. You know, we have universities. We try to admit the best students from around the world. So what's wrong with China trying to do something very similar? Or for that matter, any other country, for example, reversing the brain drain or getting back talent. Why is that problematic in a generic sense? And let me throw that over to David Kris, given his experience.
Sure. I mean, I think to acknowledge the foundation of the question with which I sort of agree, and I think I said, I mean, there are very hard questions here around whether and to what extent businesses, academic institutions, government agencies, and government programs should favor engagement, collaboration, and interaction as opposed to disengagement and isolation. And you see in the Ukraine situation, American and Western businesses making all kinds of choices that reflect, their perspective and their role in society. I think there's a couple of reasons to be concerned about China's 1,000 Talents program as part of that larger constellation of choices that we have to make, and as part of the overall threat from China, which is broad, deep, wide, and enduring in space and time. The first is that, at least for some of us, the vision of governance that China espouses and supports is not very attractive. There are many people, I suspect, in this conference who favor a U.S. Western democratic model with all of the free speech and so forth and civil liberties that it is associated with, even if not perfect, and don't care for authoritarian regimes. Second, looking at universities in particular, they are, many of them, private institutions. They are rightly, as I said, committed to transparency. But I think if they are getting governmental funding, then they owe adherence to the conditions of that funding to include transparency about other funding sources that they are getting. And that's a basic commitment that any member of a society owes to that society, following the laws. So if you're getting governmental support, and if as a condition of that support, you're supposed to disclose that you're also getting Chinese governmental support, you should disclose that. And then, the government can make whatever judgments it makes under law and in keeping with national policy set by democratically elected policymakers, et cetera, et cetera. I think, so I guess that's the broader context, and the narrower one in which I look at this. I'll just, last point, I think the reason that I criticized DOJ's approach to this using the blunt instrument of prosecution is because I think the goal here for the US government should have been, and I think probably was, to get the intelligence, to get the information, to understand what the Chinese government is doing and the way in which it is executing on the 1,000 Talents program and other programs. They didn't get that as efficiently, I think, through these prosecution efforts, and they would have done better had they used a self-reporting regime.
There seems to be a kind of irony because science and technology cooperation during the era of perestroika with the former Soviet Union, and most recently over the last 40 years in working with China, have been really part of the foundation or the bedrock that was used to improve relations. And that even in times of political difficulty between the two countries, the scientific communities, the educational communities continue to engage in their collaboration. In fact, the collaboration today has grown far bigger and more extensive than anyone would have predicted if you took simply the temperature of the political relationship, which has gone up and down. But now we seem to be taking a much more, almost even jaded perspective on this, that we've got to look before we leap. We've got to measure everything that we do. It's almost better not to do anything than perhaps make a mistake. And so how are we going to come to a point where we reduce the trepidation, but also at the same time moderate the risk? In other words, we've got to come up with a solution. And I think, David, Kris, you've left us with the notion, okay, maybe the China initiative wasn't the right initiative, but we do have a problem. So, without, making everything about the China initiative, how do we deal with that? Because we've got other threats, as you've all indicated, from other countries. How can we find that fine line and not do ourselves an injustice in terms of benefiting from internationalization and yet not being naive or foolish in not considering the potential, problems?
I'll just say one sentence and then shut up so that others can speak, which is that my sense, but those of you with academic affiliations on this conference could speak more clearly to it, is that the universities, I think, have stepped up their compliance programs to ensure adequate transparency and disclosure of foreign funding. So, I think that's a way that things can perhaps get better. They can develop better compliance programs the same way private sector corporations that run into difficulties do so. And I don't know, but I would invite comment on whether and to what extent that enhanced internal compliance has the same kind of chilling, stifling, or terrifying effects as a knock on the door from the federal BI.
Rebecca?
If I could, yes, I just wanted to amplify what David Kris was saying. And you know, universities have definitely stepped up in their compliance and increased transparency. And I see that every day and truly appreciate that from a funding agency perspective. We have to be clear, of course, about why we need this disclosure information. We need it to make good funding decisions. And of course, if someone is being funded by another government to do the same thing that they're proposing to NSF to do, not only is it, you know, against research integrity, it's unfair to all the other researchers who are not getting funded, who are being open and transparent. I do want to say that we do need to distinguish between these concerning talent plans and collaboration. So number one, the talent plans present huge risk. They are right now not illegal, however. Non-disclosure of them is what the concern is. And the non-disclosure, even after being asked several times by their home institution and by us, the funding agency, is our big concern. And so we then take administrative action such as suspension and debarment. The reason, however, they're still so risky is because I want to be clear, these talent plans often target US researchers who are full-time employees at a US university. And they are presented with an employment contract that has concerning obligations, such as having to have a quota number of publications per year, having to cite the foreign institution for credit for those publications and not the US institution, having to recruit a certain number of graduate students and other researchers into the program, not through fair competition. These are the types of things that were very concerning. As you can see, that's not collaboration. So we need to make sure we're clear about that.
Anyone want to add anything further?
Yeah, Denis. So I'd make, I guess, 3 points just to respond to David Kris. I talked about in the opening remarks a little bit about the Section 117 letter that we received at Case Western Reserve. You're exactly right, David. That clearly has resulted in a much more careful examination of foreign contracts, of monies received, and reporting then to the federal government for all the reasons that that all of you have talked about. And frankly, for the 30 years prior, something like that, I think that not only our university, but virtually every university in the country didn't report those things, not because it was malicious that they didn't want to report it, but because it was never enforced. And so now that it's being enforced, I think that there is compliance that's going on. I'll just sort of parenthetically say that because of the way it was done, and this again goes to David's remarks, the collateral damage is that people are very afraid of what that will mean. Now, over time, that may go away. That's not a FBI knock at the door. That's disclosing information, and for the most part, from what I can tell from our researchers, they're happy to disclose what they're receiving. The second sort of answer to your question that you posed, Denis, is how do we do this? Is this rules of the road discussion that I think we need to have not only with China but more broadly, so that it is understood what can and cannot happen in the lab, what needs to be disclosed, what kind of relationships can you have. So I think that's a second way forward. And then just a third sort of quick point based on what David Hoffman raised, which I think is a much more difficult issue and question, which has to do with the sort of the broad approach that governments, and I think in particular, David, you were referring to the Chinese government approach about how research will be looked at and what it will mean for researchers, be they student or faculty researchers, in the future. Those are broad societal and national issues. that I think are much harder to deal with as we move forward.
Denis,
David, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just comment on that a bit. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think continuing to separate these issues out is critically important, because I think the ways we mitigate the risks from each of them are potentially different. I think looking at the Q&A a bit of what, I think if we're talking about national security risks, there are different types of controls that we can put in place specifically for research that is going to be then used for systems and or technologies that have national security implications. And I realize sometimes that's difficult to categorize that, but there are specific controls that we can put in place there that would restrict the folks that would be able to do that type of research to folks that could get a national security clearance or have certain citizenship requirements. If we're talking about just effective and efficient use of US government resources and money like NSF grants, well, disclosure then might be an appropriate response to that particular risk. If we're worried about national economic competitiveness, coming back, I think, Denis, to one of your earlier questions, that strikes me as potentially even a different set of responses. And that might be more around recognizing the value that comes from collaboration, but then also the risks that if we don't have appropriate and really robust industrial policy here in the United States to help entities bring new innovations to market, that we are going to potentially allow other countries like China to be able to do more quickly if we do not have effective trade policy to be able to take measures to make sure that it is at least close to an level playing field if we are competing in the market from innovations that have been developed in China and innovations that have been developed here. Those things, I think these are different levers that we can pull to try to address that particular type of risk.
Well, let me push on this a little bit. We heard from the president's panel yesterday that one of their biggest concerns is the inadequacy of federal funding for research, and that whatever graph or whatever data they're showing, it does show an absolute decline over the last 10, 15 years. And this is a problem of big concern. So if in fact a government like China or some other government is offering, big bucks, and the access is fairly easy, particularly if you're an ethnic Chinese, doesn't it make sense to take the road of least resistance? I can get a lab, a bunch of graduate students, and set up a whole research, effort back in Shanghai or somewhere. So, aren't we creating a situation that is just begging for this kind of magnet to attract lots of flies, lots of people, and we're not really fixing our own system, of course, which is, I think all of us would be in agreement that we've got to do a better job on this end of the equation. Anyone want to comment on that one?
I think for all of us, the answer is yes, of course, right? We would love to have more research funding. And where there's the potential for at least increased funding being authorized through a combination of competes and USICA. And as we all know, that's not an appropriation, that's not the actual funding being delivered. However, it's not mutually exclusive, because also in competes and USICA, we have several research security provisions, and we have the potential for limitations on the type of research we're allowed to fund and with whom we're allowed to collaborate. So I think the increased funding, yes, but again, we do need to figure out these bigger questions of how to deal with this geopolitical context. I think, we do have concerns about authoritarian governments, and how can we satisfy our congressional stakeholders so that increased funding does come? while at the same time maintaining as much openness in the system as possible. That's the million billion dollar question that I don't have an answer to, but that's certainly part of my thinking every day in forming policy in this area.
So do you think, I mean, this raises a really fundamental question, which is, are the interests of the stakeholders diverging or converging? In other words, are we coming together on this? Because it seems to me every step of the way we seem to hit a point where our interests are not just smoothly or easily shared. Well, let me give you an example. Recently, OSTP published a list of these 19 critical emerging technologies. And on this list, of course, we think they're critical to the national security of the United States, which then sets up a set of barriers now of who can play in terms of international partnerships and who can collaborate. And it raises then down the line, what kind of students can be recruited and from what countries can they come from? I mean, this seems to me that every time we set up a new program, a new effort like this, we then create more and more hurdles that we've got to overcome, to the point in which, again, this will raise this, is it worth it? In other words, can we just, are we going to become so insular at some point that we're going to hurt ourselves? Absolutely, because the world of 2022 and beyond is just so very different than what it was before. And all of these, yesterday Artie spoke about the fourth industrial revolution. All of these technologies in bioscience, AI, quantum computing, and all down the line, they are all technologies with a little tweak and a little twist. They can help build the next missile system, as well as they can solve the next traffic problem, in a crowded urban area. And so we've got this kind of dilemma about, are we going to figure this all out in some ways? Do we need an agency, for example, that's going to do this? Where should the decision making about this lie? Because if we leave each of the stakeholders to pursue their own interests, I'm not so sure it's all going to converge into one happy kumbaya moment.
If I could just jump in on that, I mean, I'm generally, as a security guy, I guess, generally pessimistic and the purveyor of doom and gloom. I'll sound a note of optimism here. I don't think there will be an agency here, but there could be more intelligent, coordinated policy. I mean, if you look and do sort of a net assessment of the United States as against some of its foreign adversaries or competitors like China, the authoritarians definitely have a net advantage in unity of effort and whole of society undertakings. And we don't have that. We have divergence of interests and, businesses, academic and institutions of government all following, their own particular sense of what is best. And as a result, our public-private partnerships across the last, 50 years, and this has been lamented deeply, widely in the literature, just don't and haven't worked as well to produce the desired results. I think, again, by way of sounding a tiny note of optimism, and it does go against the grain a bit, we are seeing in the cyber space now very, very significantly increased energy from government and a increased willingness from private institutions, principally businesses, but I think it may spread, to engage in those partnerships because the threat is so severe. And if that takes hold, and if it spreads, programs like NSA's cybersecurity centers of excellence and the like, then it is possible that public-private partnerships to include between government and business and academic institutions in this country will accelerate and do better. We'll never have the kind of authoritarian unity of effort, nor would we want it. But I do think there is some sign that if we play our cards right, we may get a little better at this.
Other comments?
Yeah, Denis, I would like to just comment on what David said. That's exactly the same environment that I see. If you look at venture capital firms that invest in cybersecurity, they are focused increasingly on collaboration and looking for solutions from outside of the United States. I think also if you look at what happened at the State of the Union and you look at the way that my former colleague, the now CEO of Intel, Pat Gelsinger, was featured for his investment for the new fab in Ohio and the potential expansion of that to be a $100 billion investment if the US will step up with its industrial policy and make contributions into that to incentivize that. There's not a discussion about pulling the fabs and the research out of China while doing that. There's not a discussion necessarily of ceasing collaboration between the different global locations that Intel has across its fairly complicated supply chain that also includes numerous university collaborations in the US and in China. But so I think we run the risk of viewing these things in, pardon me for using the metaphor from, since I'm just talking about Intel, a binary fashion of thinking it's all collaboration or no collaboration, instead of thinking that we want to sort this collaboration potentially in some different ways, particularly if we're finding that the results of the way that we were doing collaborative research are actually creating risks for the company or for the country in a way that really need to be reorganized, particularly I think where we found significant supply chain risks over the course of the past decade. So I feel like we are in a process of resorting with that, but I don't think it's a resorting where we want to take things to zero. I think it's a way to try to build resiliency, and that's what I see both in semiconductors and in cybersecurity.
Great, great. Okay, we have a question from the audience, which is about IP stealing and espionage, etc. Given the world of global brain circulation that seems to be going on, is it even feasible to control and prevent this kind of activity? Is there another way to go about it rather than looking at it from a political point of view, looking at it from more of a technical point of view, that is to build a number of pathways and procedures and put those in place? And if there's non-compliance, basically you're sort of kicked out of the game. You imagine some kind of bilateral or multilateral consortium where there are these rules of the road per se. And then if you're not a good citizen, your universities or your think tanks don't get a chance to play. Is that something that could be created and has some viability? Rebecca?
I think the answer is yes, absolutely. And I think that's what we are certainly thinking within the government. I'm part of a G7 working group on research security and integrity. And I think as part of that, we're thinking very much along those lines. Put our money where our mouth is and demonstrate productive, principled international collaboration with clear rules of the road through such a consortium. I think the elephant in the room is who should be part of such a consortium. As you said, do you allow everyone until they don't follow the rules of the road and then you kick them out? Or do you limit the consortium to certain countries? I don't think any of us have a good answer to that, but that's something that certainly we have to have as part of the conversation. I think the challenge we have, of course, is that this goes beyond IP theft to the taking of ideas and the taking of people in ways that are unethical. And so I think that's another concern we have to deal with. But I think a consortium is a good way to go.
Okay. Any other comment on that one?
Denis, I'd comment on in two ways. Agreed with the idea of a consortium. The question of where that what level of society it sits in, I think, is one that we need to think about. What Rebecca just talked about was a governmental consortium that presumably, if the United States entered into it, then somehow universities would be obligated to be to follow those rules. I would suggest that universities need to be a active participant in any of those conversations, because at the end of the day, this is where a lot of the research and a lot of the people that are conducting the research are housed, and you don't want, in a society like the U.S. at least, to have these kinds of things imposed. You want to have a seat at the table, and I would just sort of provide a little bit of context here. The idea of sort of stealing of IP and espionage, et cetera. This has been going on, I think all of us know, for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's not just gone on by one society stealing from another. It tends to happen when the more advanced society has the IP, and the lesser advanced society is then taking it. You know, early in the in our own when the United States was first established, you saw that some of that happened with you know, mills and other things from England to the U.S. So we need to set up rules. We need to make sure that we're following them. We need to also understand that these aren't things that are going to go away. It's a basic part of how society has operated for probably thousands of years.
Okay, let's take another question from our audience. Traditionally, FFRDCs and UARCs have led the way in terms of national security related research. What kind of role might these organizations play in the future in terms of spurring U.S. innovation, but also doing better or more extensive partnering with American universities? Maybe this is a Rebecca question.
I could take that. So the reason, of course, that FFRDCs, which are federally funded research and development centers, and UARCs, which are university affiliated research centers, are doing national security related research separate from the research institutions themselves is because because of that clear delineation that's needed. There's all sorts of certifications, security clearances, structures that these entities need to develop in order to be qualified to perform research, national security related research. And understandably, many research institutions do not want to go down that path. And so I think it makes it very challenging then to have such collaboration between the unclassified side and the classified side of research. An example of where that has started, and it honestly has created confusion, is there's a new term called controlled but unclassified information. And it's a term that's, I think, in the research community has a lot of confusion. For us, it's very confusing because it's meant to say there are certain areas that you should protect somewhat, but not as much as classified information. And you get into such a gray area that it's incredibly, incredibly confusing. So in my view, I think having a clear distinction between what should occur in those more closed settings and what shouldn't occur is good, because again, we need to preserve what is out in the open and, you know, what is shared more broadly and widely. And to me, that should be the default, with the more closed research having to have a very particular specific reason for occurring.
Okay, in the area of international collaboration, there is this effect that we have. So if you look at China today, they have a National Natural Science Foundation and modeled after the US NSF. Their patent laws were modeled after the German experience to a large extent. And there are a number of countries in which their core academic institutions like universities have emulated in many ways the building of our R1 universities and that experience that's occurred here in the United States. How can we use that to our advantage? The fact that other countries want to emulate us, they look at the advantages that we do have, in other words, the things that seem to be going well, and take that one step further so that the kind of issues and problems we have been discussing can be perhaps moderated or ameliorated even over the longer term.
I'll start again just
Okay.
just because, of course, with NSFC being modeled on NSF. So yes, the NSFC in China being modeled on NSF is extremely positive, and a lot of the merit review processes for competitive selection of proposals, et cetera, were also adopted from NSF. That's a very positive step. However, there have been structural changes that Denis and Caroline know even better than I in China, where NSFC used to be an independent agency similar to NSF. NSF is independent. It no longer is. Now it's under the Ministry of Science and Technology, and the heads of the Ministry of Science and Technology are part of the Chinese Communist Party. And there's a much more direct line now to more political obligations. And certainly that is a concern. So what I'm saying is that, yes, it's good to model these, and hopefully export the practices that NSF and other funding agencies have. However, in practice, sometimes it ends up being more concerning than anything else. Thanks.
Okay. Another question, because of the nature of our system, the United States government, for diplomatic reasons, may sign protocols and agreements with other countries, bilateral, sometimes multilateral, in order to push forward science and technology cooperation or educational exchanges. They think that is going to be a good thing in terms of building relationships and over the long term building trust. But under those big umbrella agreements, all of a sudden, then we kind of go into the decentralized mode of the way U.S. higher education operates. Our universities, and again in 1979, when these agreements were signed with China, no one could have ever imagined the extent to which this collaboration and cooperation would be built and developed, and there's still even momentum, even despite things that are going on, because as David Fleshler said, the grand challenges still remain out there, and whether we like it or not, both countries in this case or many other countries want to do this. I mean, how can we find the right way to do this? Do we need more regulation? Do we need a Department of Education, for example, that would become more involved in oversight? Notice, where's the oversight going to come from in order to make these things happen? Because right now, again, we're still flailing around trying to figure it all out. We know we have a problem. We may disagree to the extent to which how big or small it is, but we still haven't hit that point where so here's the organizational arrangement or institutional arrangement that's going to help us find clearer sailing into the future. David Hoffman, do you want to take a stab at this? Coming from the outside of the system, looking in.
Yeah, that's, I don't know. I was hoping Kris was going to jump in as far as what governmental institution should provide the right oversight. I think I might want to question the assumption that it should be a central organization providing oversight for what I think are a variety of different problems. I think there's a particular role for the Department of Justice. I think there's also probably a great role here for the Department of Commerce in certain contexts, but I'd be really interested in what others would have to say.
I mean, I guess to take that invitation up, as I said before, I am not sure I can imagine a single new government agency charged with overseeing all of these issues. The last adventure that approaches that level of effort and reorg would be the Department of Homeland Security, and this would be, I think, a considerably larger reorg. I do think there has to be coherent national policy that then gets executed through the various agencies, including but not limited to DOJ, which frankly has a relatively small role here, I think. I mean, taking it at a slightly wider lens, freedom is attractive. I talked about the net assessment against authoritarian regimes, and they enjoy better effort, I think, unity of effort across their whole of society. We have freedom, and we do a lot of things extremely well, in part because we don't fall victim as readily to national level groupthink. We fight and claw and scream at each other and so forth. There are problems with that too, but it does, get you the creative destruction of capitalism and free thought and all that stuff. And our companies lead and our universities lead. They're still terribly, terribly attractive in lots of great ways. And so the question is how to use those advantages. And I think the questions that, policymakers at the national level would have to think through and then execute efficiently and effectively through the various government agencies and other avenues are we going to focus on core national security information and anti-espionage efforts and punish those who try to engage in that? It's the second oldest profession, so I'm not sure we're going to, put an end to it. Are we going to focus on IP theft of unclassified intellectual property and misuse of that? Are we going to focus on trade policy? Are we going to focus on violations of the law of armed conflict or international human rights violations of the sort that unfortunately we're seeing quite a bit of just now? So I think, we have a lot of advantages and we have to use them smartly. And we have to use them in this area through both domestic and our foreign policy across the whole range of government programs, which are huge. And it's complicated and it's super hard. But that's sort of the framing for me of the issue that I think is being raised by those questions.
Well, let me add something in here. We haven't mentioned organizations like AAU or ACE or even David Fleshler from AIEA. These organizations are non-governmental, but they represent all of the university people who are engaged in these international activities. And as David said, sometimes Fleshler said, sometimes he's the gatekeeper in his job, keeping the university engaged and the rules of the road in terms of Case Western University. What about the role of these non-governmental agencies in the United States? Could they play a much more powerful role in helping to bring a little bit more order and providing some of these rules that we've been referring to?
So Denis, I'll take that up. The brief answer, I think, is yes. To go back to the context of your earlier question, which I think David Kris outlined very well, in a federal system like the United States, we simply aren't going to have a policy czar that is going to come down and either in any of those areas, trade or espionage or any of the other areas, going to dictate what's going to happen. So then you turn to, well, what are the possibilities? And you do have national associations made up of many, in our case, universities. So, ACE is made up of 1,800 universities. AAU is made up of the, 65 major research universities, APLU, the public land grants, et cetera, et cetera. And among those organizations, they do represent and then obviously go out to their constituency to talk about whatever the various issues are. And so I think that what you're proposing is something that we should think about and focus on as a way forward in trying to determine, so we've used this term rules of the road quite often now, but trying to determine what the rules of the road are that institutions will not only buy into, but will have a say in how those rules are formulated.
Great. Okay, let me take one last question, which I think is an interesting one. I'd like to see if I can get some response. Climate change, which is one of those grand challenge issues that universities and everyone seems to, of course, be interested in. It increasingly now has been seen as not just simply an environmental problem, it's now having big national security implications. And as it increasingly involves national security questions, all of a sudden the sensitivity of the technologies, the nature of the collaborations that we're engaged in, all of a sudden they've taken on a different tone than they've had originally. What can universities do, particularly the ones who are really active in these areas, to do a better job of working with government, maybe even all governments, so that we can minimize the risk factors and yet come up with better answers to the problems that the world is facing? Big question. Anyone want to take a stab? The reason why I mentioned this is that I in my role of working with the Duke president, we're always talking about what can we find as safe areas to extend our collaboration with China. Where can we do more, be more active? And of course, environment and climate come up. But increasingly, we read about the national security aspects of these, and all of a sudden they take on a very different tone. So seems to me that something we're going to have to come to grips with, and particularly as that problem's not going away.
Denis, I wonder if the national security implications of climate, though, might be a little bit different than some of the other national security implications of other technologies that we worry about, unless there's areas of climate technology where we are very concerned about other countries weaponizing them to make our climate much worse than their climate. It strikes me that while climate has substantial national security concerns, there are national security concerns that may be common ground across for us and China and us and other countries. And for that reason might not present as much of an issue, and therefore could be misperceived to create an issue, and that might just require a lot of thoughtful dialogue to demonstrate that it's common ground instead of a reason for rejecting useful collaboration.
Well, I think that's probably what Secretary Kerry is trying to do in his travel to China and dialogue about climate change, probably trying to find that. And if we could find that, then I think universities might find a roadmap to get involved in increased collaboration for hopefully win-win outcomes. Okay, well, we've come to that witching hour where it's 11 o'clock and we're at the end of our session. Let me thank everyone for some really insightful comments and for opening up a number of new vistas. I think this, I hope, didn't just cover the traditional ground, but we've opened up a lot of new areas to consider, and I'm glad we had a chance to do this. The issues are going to be even more complex going forward, and I think they're going to continue to represent challenges for our universities and other universities all around the world. So it's still never going to be a dull day. So thank you again to everyone. And let me just announce that our next session is going to begin in about 15 minutes at 11:15. And it's our session about industry-university relations. So again, thank you to everyone, and we'll be seeing you in the future. Take care now.